Okay, so our next section from King Lear, looking at how we can use it for the AQA Paper 1 English Literature A Level Tragedy, is again from Act 1, Scene 4, but this is a little further on from the last time, and it's where King Lear and Goneril are arguing. And it's a good example of the kind of power and energy and drama of the play. We get the characters here, we're always going to be interested in that, and obviously Goneril and Lear are the main ones that emerge from this little sequence. The fool is there and referred to and has a few lines too. What we see here, if we want to locate the passages, it's the middle really of this quite long scene in which Lear eventually decides to leave Goneril's palace to go what he thinks he can go to, Goneril's sister Regan. So it's the tragedy unfolding very quickly. It's come after the introduction of the fools giving us a new kind of dimension to the play, almost like a chorus or like the voice of the audience, questioning what's happening and prompting Lear perhaps to think more deeply about the consequences of his actions. In terms of the tragedy, it's unfolding quickly. The consequences of foolish actions in this play are seen immediately here, whereas even in the subplot we see Gloucester's folly doesn't become obvious to him until much later in the play. So if we look at the beginning, we're going to look from lines 190 to 241 from Act 1, Scene 4. So if we look at the beginning of this sequence, it's where a fool had just spoken, and then Goneril turns on Lear, mentioning the fool. Not only said this, you're all licensed fools. So she's really angry about the idea of license, freedom. The fool is allowed to say whatever he wants. Lear himself wants to behave in a way of freedom. He wants to do whatever he wants and have no consequences for that. So in some sense, you can almost sympathise with Goneril here, that she has a point, that there has to be limits. There can't just be in total freedom, surely. Anarchy, really, is what Lear seems to be proposing. And later in the play, we'll see Shakespeare return to that idea that, questioning the nature of rules and law and limits and saying that we're all equally bad, so nobody has any right to tell anybody what to do, really. And anarchy really is the essential state of things. But he doesn't say that with any relish, really. He says it as if to the play seems to at least to say lawlessness, anarchy, lack of control is the abiding state of the human condition, but it's horrific and terrible as well. It's not. It's nothing about freedom and hope. She sets out in that first speech there her complaints, and they seem quite rational. And as I say, there is a sense you can almost sympathise with Goneril here. Again, the language is full of a sense of noise and chaos and lack of control, and that's what the play keeps doing all the time, just both on a grand scale but also on a micro scale, in just a casual way almost. Like Shakespeare seems to throw in this sense of chaos and lack of control and noise and language that's violent. Here we get carp and quarrel and insolent and not to be endured riots. The not to be endured, I think, is where we might see Shakespeare very subtly turning our sympathy against Goneril, in that the not to be endured is the language of what we probably call a Karen now, a fussy, overly entitled person who feels that they're allowed to say what can and cannot be endured. That makes us think of her as rather sort of puritanical and self-important, perhaps. She twists her argument, says, I was going to look for some redress here, but now I start to think there's no arguing with you. You're not going to respond positively if I ask you to moderate the behaviour of your knights, basically, is what her contention is. So she says it in a rather roundabout way, and you could say maybe that there's some nervousness here, that she's trying to kind of butter him up and avoid direct confrontation and yet make her point? Or is she trying to argue her case and add more reasons, and therefore the language, the sentence structure, for instance, just seems to drag on and on, the semicolons and commas, and it's all like one long sentence from sir onwards right down to the end of the speech, really, isn't it? So what she's saying there is, anyway, I don't know if I can trust you to put this right. And the fool here chips in, which doesn't really go very well. Goneril has already said she doesn't appreciate the fool. And he says the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that it's had its head bit off by its young. And then out went the candle, we were left darkling, which seems to be another metaphor, slightly, like he's mixing his metaphors. But yeah, darkling is the sort of mood of the play as a whole. It's a very dark play. Everything is, all light has been snuffed out. But that idea of the, literally in nature, and there's lots of references to nature, of course, in the play. In nature, the cuckoo lays its egg in the sparrow's nest, and then the sparrow unwittingly feeds this cuckoo chick thinking it's its own, but the chick is massive. The cuckoo is much bigger than the sparrow, so this chick which the sparrow thinks of it as its own grows bigger than the sparrow and then eats the sparrow, bites its head off. And that seems to be a decent enough metaphor for what's happening here, that Goneril has now grown to be an adult and now she's going to destroy the parent. So there's a violent imagery there, obviously, and a sense of threat, sense of something that's both natural and unnatural. It's an image from nature, but it's an image of nature as being unnatural, if you like, weird, and not normal, and not how we find things should be, really. And so what Shakespeare's saying, perhaps, is that nature is not a reliable metaphor for goodness, in fact, and that the nature of things is chaotic and grim and horrible. And that really, in that sense, Goneril is just conforming to what Shakespeare might be saying about the state of the world, the universe. The next bit is a classic bit of Lear here. He uses this rhetorical moment, and you can see again how annoying this would be if you were his daughter. So now he sort of plays this game of, are you our daughter? And she tries to twist him back to being sensible and says, oh, don't start all this nonsense, basically. All I'm trying to say is, be as you should be as you rightly are. She tries to butter him up and say, just be yourself, and you've become strange, you've become out of control recently. And then again, the fool has another little chip in. May not the ass know when the cart draws the horse, which is a classic metaphor for things being topsy-turvy and back to front. And here Goneril seems to be taking the lead over Lear, and so the fool is pointing that out, that this child should not be telling the parent what to do, which is a big thing throughout the play, because of course that was part of the subplot as well, that Edgar apparently had said that the child should rule the father when the father was too old. The whoop jug I love thee is again part of the chaos of the play. It's part of the nonsense of that the fool adds, the sort of jokey references and songs and strange noises and shouts. I mean, basically what he's saying is, isn't this hilarious? Isn't this ridiculous? Lear, though, presses on. He ignores that interjection and presses on with his bit of rhetorical play, where he's basically going to try and play this game of, well, I can't be King Lear because I'm not being treated like King Lear. So who am I? Who's this woman? Who am I? If I am being treated like this, what's happened to the world? Which is a true reflection on what has happened. Actually, the world has been turned upside down and everything has gone against what it used to be. But Lear says it as a kind of what he thinks is a sort of sarcastic or ironic game, and he expects Goneril to say, oh, well, sorry, Dad, I realise I'm misbehaving here because this shouldn't be happening. So, he says this is not Lear. Now, of course, the irony is that Lear has in many ways lost his self. He's given up his power, he's given up his authority, and he is losing his sanity, beginning to, at least at this stage. And so in some ways, all of this is very, very true, even though he means it's a joke. And then he says that great line, "Who is it that can tell me who I am?" Which is kind of the cry of all existential philosophy. Who can tell me who I am? I don't know who I am in this world anymore. I don't have any way of looking for an authoritative description of my essential self. Now, 20th century existentialist philosophers thought that was liberating, that you didn't have to believe in an essential self. You could write your new self every day if you wanted. You could decide who you are. But other people might find that as a pained cry of, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I sit in this world. And in fact, that feels very 21st century, feels very modern concern, that we both want to be able to write ourselves and say who we are, decide our identity in many different ways, and that's quite liberating and exciting. But also we feel confused and lost and troubled. We don't know who we are. We don't know what our purpose and role is. We can't, many of us, go back to religion and philosophy and politics. None of those things seem to be providing us with stable answers, which some people had done in the past. And so we're left with this kind of uncertainty all the time, and that's manifesting in this 21st century talk of anxiety. Everyone's got anxiety. Well, because we've kind of had the rug pulled from underneath us, and we don't know whether we can even stand at all, let alone where we stand. Now, Lear is asking that question rhetorically, but of course, in some ways he's asking it really as well. He doesn't quite know who he was. He never really knew who he was. And of course, ironically, that's exactly what Godwin and Regan said about him. He hath ever but slenderly known himself. He doesn't never really known who he was in many ways. And Lear's asking that question, and of course the fool answers it. Lear's shadow, that's who you are. You're a shadow of your former self. Lear wants to continue with his discourse, and so he says, I would learn that, thinking, I sense there's something worth knowing there, but I haven't got time to deal with it. Now, that is also ironically, Shakespeare's throwing that in. He does it a couple of times in the play. That might rather be the sense of the audience's response to a lot of what we hear, particularly from the fool, who throws all these proverbs and little gobbets of wisdom out there, and you don't have a chance to take them all in, and you sort of want to rewind or pause and go, hang on a minute, what was that? What did they just say? Brilliantly and wonderfully in Richard II, some years before this play, Shakespeare had his main character Richard say, after a comment from his rival, say that again. He wanted to think about it and pause. And there's a lot of us want to do that when maybe if you're watching Shakespeare on stage, particularly, you go, what was that? Say that again. Oh, it's gone. So there's a lot in that moment, I think. But he wants to continue with the joke. Oh, I think I could, you could try and persuade me that I had daughters, but that can't be true. Because you can't be my daughter, you wouldn't treat me like this. You wouldn't be rude to me and try and stop me from having my fun. And the fool makes his final contribution to this section when he says, they will make an obedient father. So, there's a big joke there that obedient children is what it should be, but he's going to be obedient father. And he's right, the fool sees it. And he's the first of the characters who really sees what's going on, who's on the good side, if you like. Edmund, Godwin and Regan have a good sight of what's happening, are really quite sharply aware of the truth of things. But the other good characters like Edgar, Gloucester and Lear are very easily confused and troubled and uncertain and blinded to reality. So, and even Kent, who has some insight into the mistake that Lear's making, can't see a way of dealing with that doesn't bring him into conflict with Lear. So Fool's the only one really who has a clear sight of what's happening and is on the good side, doesn't use that clear insight for his own cynical ends, but instead trying to help Lear. So he represents one of the sort of ongoing threads of the play, which is that way in which the world becomes horrific if we never do anything to help one another. So finally, however, Lear continues with his joke, your name, fair gentleman. Who are you? Gentlewoman, sorry. Who are you? Who's this woman? She can't be my dog. She wouldn't treat me like this. Now, again, you can see that There's not much humour in this. It's another kind of discourse. There's lots of different types of language and ways of speaking in the play, from the truthful, the formal, the bitter, the cruel, the angry, the foolish, the comical, the insane. And here there's a kind of sarcastic, joking satire going on. Maybe he is learning a bit from the fool because he's using humour to make his point. Conrad's not impressed. And she makes the final speech of our little section here. We'll stop at the end of this bit. She says, this admiration, this behaviour, this put on show is typical of your new pranks. Really vicious kind of hardness about that short single syllable word there. Yeah, prank. Not prank as in playing a trick, I think, more as in being stupid, messing about. So I ask you to understand what my purposes are and see them rightly, So she's asking for justice. And again, this is probably the last point, really, at which we see Goneril as a character who we can in any way sympathise with. But we might here say, get her point. She has got a point. You're old and reverend, be wise. You've got 100 knights here, the disordered, debauched and bold. Again, vigorous, energetic, anarchic language of violence coming into all the speeches in reflecting her anger and frustration, but also reflecting the general chaotic atmosphere of the play. And again, on stage, I think we need a sense that the knights are around and there's misbehaving, drinking and shouting and perhaps interfering somewhat in this conversation. So a riotous inn is the phrase she uses to describe how her court has become because of all these knights. Again, that's the sense of the chaos of the play. Everything is disintegrating and falling apart. Epicureanism, which means in this case what they mean by that is just sort of drunkenness, really. Lust, it's more like a tavern or a brothel. So again, no sense of civility and civilization, everything chaotic and anarchic. And the whole play seems to teeter on the edge of that anarchy all the time. So there must be a remedy. Shame itself would ask for it. Disquantity your train. Just take a few men off, send a few men away, and let them behave as if they know themselves and you. Know yourself is the classic ancient Greek philosophy. That's your purpose in life, is to know yourself. If you do that, the rest of it is fine. Of course, that is exactly what Lear doesn't do when he reflects back on what he just said. Who is it who can tell me who I am? He has ever but slenderly known himself. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know his position in the world. And that what he thinks is he is all powerful, and he's been told that all his life. What he doesn't realise is he's basically the same as everybody else, and until he can face that, he's never going to really have any sense of wisdom or even any sense of ease in his world. So the drama here is conflict, is the two characters at odds. Lear putting on a performance again. Everything's rather performed and over the top. Goneril, with some justice, asking for a more civilized sort of atmosphere in her own home, which seems like she's got a point. And Lear seems very unreasonable and very difficult to deal with, and it's a very vivid portrayal, I think, of that relationship between the foolish and ridiculous and unhelpful parent who's getting old but doesn't want to accept that, and the frustrated child who feels now that they have the responsibility of looking after their parent. Again, this is very much a 21st century narrative too, as we have an aging population, as our health services improve to the point where we can keep people reasonably fit and alive much longer, but people often have this long sense of sort of decaying away as they get older. They're kept alive but not functioning very well, and it's down to children and grandchildren to support the aging relatives. So Shakespeare seems to have sort of foreseen that here too, as it was not as common in his day when people didn't live so long generally. Lear is supposed to be 80, and he says for upwards of 80 years, a score being 20. So very old by anybody's sense, but certainly in those days, not many people lived to be that old in Shakespearean times. As far as ancient Britain, we have not much of an idea. So, more conflict, more drama, more tension. Thinking about on the stage there, we might think about the way in which characters move, the way the fool uses his body language to shield himself from Goneril's wrath and sort of pops up and then hides back. Lear with his kind of pantomime-like gestures as he kind of plays the role of asking this sarcastic question. Goneril with a kind of sternness and a body language but maybe also showing that frustration. There's a sense of a backstory here that's never obviously shown in the play of a long history of difficult relationship between Goneril and her father, and a frustration about being the daughter of a rather selfish and ignorant patriarchal figure. But Lear's shadow here, we have a shadow of the former man. And in that we see just the foreshadowing of all of our end of life period, when we become a shadow of our former self, we become old and less capable. So many dimensions going on within just a very short section here. Lots to dig into.